live. So in this webinar, we're going to be exploring how medtech startups can design early clinical trials and put together hospital partnerships that endure beyond their first-in-human studies. So we have some great panelists here today, four folks with backgrounds on both sides of the table. So both major hospital systems as well as startups to share their perspectives on preclinical study design. So how do you actually move from preclinical into clinical in an effective way? Cost drivers for clinical study planning, structuring agreements, and looking at international site selection as well for clinical trials. We're going to highlight how startups can leverage post-market studies additionally. So even if you're a startup with a product already on the market, we'll talk about how to optimize that and leverage this partnership long-term. We'll also be talking a bit about how to utilize health systems data sets and generate pragmatic evidence to drive adoption and payer support. So I hope that you guys learn some great practical strategies to turn these pilot trials into these sustainable long-term partnerships with health systems and innovation hubs here today. So would love to start off with some introductions of our amazing panelists we've got here today. So first up is Julie Henry, who is the Chair of Business Development at Mayo Clinic. Would love to hear an intro from you, Julie.
Hello, everyone. As Nicole said, my name is Julie Henry. I'm one of the chairs in the Department of Business Development at Mayo Clinic. I've been at Mayo for 33 years. I started out in the research laboratories doing peptide synthesis, protein sequencing work before I went back to school and did my MBA and moved over to the business side of the house. Currently, I oversee our commercialization team. So we have two functions within our office. We have our standard tech transfer office, but we also do a lot of gap analysis for the practice and look at what the departments need and solutions. And we look to the marketplace to find companies that have solutions that will fit our needs, and we work on that as well. I oversee, as I said, the commercialization team, which has all of the contracting individuals that do all of the agreements for our BD department. So everything from a license agreement to a co-development agreement to JVs to startups and everything in between. So I'm pleased to be here with everyone today.
Super lucky to have you here, Julie. Next up, we've got Sandra Elliott from Hackensack Meridian Health.
Hi, I'm Sandra Elliott. Thank you for having me today. I am the Chief Innovation and Commercialization Officer for Hackensack Meridian Health. Been there for about 20 years now. I would say if you are not familiar with Hackensack, we are the largest health delivery system in the state of New Jersey, 18 hospitals, little over 500 different locations to receive care. So almost soup to nuts. We provide a lot of different services and applications for providing care in the state of New Jersey. So my role is really focused in on both internal and external innovation, very similar to Julie in many respects. But one of the things that we're really super excited about are those new solutions that are being developed in the startup environment that can potentially meet some of the unmet clinical needs that we have as a network. So I'm super excited to hear a little bit more about some of the companies that may be here today. But more importantly, as we're here for you, feel free to ask any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And good reminder, too, for those of you on LinkedIn, if you have any questions for these incredible panelists over the next hour, please drop those in the event comments section. So the amazing Gabby from our team is going to get me those on the side, and we will utilize this live webinar format best we can with all these experts. So now that we've heard of Julie and Sandra on the hospital healthcare system side of the table, let's hear from our startup leaders. So first, we've got Paul Hare from the Harvard Grid. Paul, would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm a big fan of Dr. Nicole Black and longtime friend. Thank you for inviting me to join this group. I currently run an entrepreneurship center in Harvard's engineering school, so sort of partner with our researchers and faculty to help shape and lift ideas from labs to markets to see more science and engineering at the university have impact in the world. But before, for a decade, a little over a decade before, I did mostly early stage medical devices focused in tissue repair, non-pharmacological pain management, and a little bit in the right side, the economics of novel care delivery methods using ML.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. Looking forward to hearing your insight. And then last, certainly not least, we've got Maria Artunduega, who is the CEO and founder of Samai, also was in our MTI cohort last year in 2024, and furthermore was the early stage grand prize winner. So I'm super excited to have her here today because we just announced our finalists for the early stage grand prize and execution award just yesterday, I think. So really great timing to have her on here today. I know you're going to learn a ton from her today, but I'll let her introduce herself.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Maria Artunduaga. I'm a physician trained at Harvard and Berkeley, and I'm the CEO of Samai, where we are building AI-powered solutions to diagnose and manage respiratory diseases, starting with COPD. We have a co-located team between Colombia and the US, so we have a lot of experience with international and national clinical trials. We have an non-invasive sensor. We've done a lot of first-in-human trials from the start. We've raised over $3 million with grants, so I can share a lot of tips and tricks about our journey throughout this enterprise. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maria. It'll be great to have your perspective on that, especially on international trials, which we definitely got on the agenda here today. But to start us off here, I want to talk a bit about like how we start thinking about clinical trial design and also moving from preclinical studies. A lot of our startups are still at like a concept bench testing stage into first in human. So Sandra, would like to hear from you first from a hospital system perspective. What are the most important factors that you consider when deciding whether to partner on a first in human trial?
One of the key things for us is really about the magnitude of the problem. How well does this technology fit into large scale opportunities, right? So for us, if it's a large scale opportunity, we're going to be much more inclined to take a look at it because it meets more needs, right? So in a health system perspective, we do have kind of resource constraint challenges. So we're very selective in those types of technologies that we might do first in human trials with. Having said that, I think a lot of it has to do with the safety profile. It has to do with the interactions that you've already had with the FDA, early stage conversations that they've had. How well have you responded to those questions or concerns that may have been raised to the FDA? So we're looking for those organizations that are also collaborative in an approach. Are you willing to work with us to really define an approach that makes the most sense for us from a workflow perspective as well? So there are a lot of key factors that really do come into play, but those are probably the most critical for us at a large scale kind of big dot items that we're looking for as we're evaluating first in human trials. The other thing is, quite honestly, and I hate to say it because it's not necessarily always inherent, but do we have clinicians who are truly engaged and excited about the solution? So if they're not excited, to the point that they're going to help make this successful and from a running the trial perspective, we won't go down that road. It's just we're not going to we want to make sure that you've got good clinicians, not just good clinicians, but clinicians that truly are excited about that technology that you may be bringing to the table. Because otherwise, you're not going to get the full benefit of the health delivery system being a participant.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Super helpful. And I'm just curious too, like these clinicians, is it better if they're part of the Hackensack Meridian Health System or just looking for general KOLs part of their team that can support the conversation?
It's better if they're part of from our perspective, to join into a first in human trial. It's better if they're part of. And as part of that, though, I will mention that we do take a critical look at the scientific advisory board that you've got on HAP, because many times, clinicians are networked, and we have a tendency to like our people that we already know or have a comfort level with, that they are truly subject matter experts in the marketplace. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sandra. It's super helpful. So make sure your scientific advisory board has those KOLs on it for the startups on there. So Julie, from Mayo Clinic's perspective, what criteria do you guys look for to assess whether a startup is ready for a collaboration with you guys and a first in human trial?
So I think the collaborations can start at many different phases. There's a lot of times that the Mayo Clinic staff is engaged with some of these startups before you get to that first in human, while you're still in the preclinical development stage, and we're utilizing Mayo Clinic experts and knowledge to help further develop and refine the technologies. And there's certain ways we can handle that component. When we look to go to the first in human, then, as Sandra said, we need to have a clinical champion at Mayo Clinic who's willing to take this forward. They're the ones that are going to have to submit to the IRB and manage this. So it's got to be something that, one, they believe in, and two, they feel like we have the patient cohort at Mayo that can fit that trial, because it wouldn't be fair to become a clinical site and then realize we don't even have the patients that would fit the trial. That's not going to help the startup. So we look at that. And as she also said, we take a hard look at the company, the management team, who's funding them. Do they have the resources to move this forward? Also, kind of what's the expectation that they would have on Mayo and what they would want us to do versus what they're taking on themselves. So there's a lot of different moving parts in there, depending on the stage at which point the commercial entity would come to us and say, we'd like to collaborate with you.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, super helpful. And yes, seeing a lot of themes here around the team being really important, but also, what resources do you have already in place to actually make this happen? And, is this a good fit considering the patient population and demographics of it for the technology ultimately you're trying to bring to market? So, as we're starting to think about moving into these, I'm curious to hear from you, Paul, like what are some maybe the cost-effective methods? You work with a lot of engineers in your current role with that are very creative in terms of bench testing designs, but also KOL testimonials. So from these great clinicians that could speak to it, that could work well to generate credible evidence to convince a hospital or healthcare system to run a first-in-human study.
Yeah, and in fact, I think the real beauty in thinking about that question, Nicole, is almost thinking about your audience. If you think of this as kind of a sale to get a first-in-human study done, you've just heard some really great insights from Sandra and Julie about what are important to them. So clearly what you need to present is you need to address those topics, and knowing what those topics are is figuring out how to do it cost effectively. So some things that we've used in the past is we design, like for instance, you heard from Sandra about risk as an example. If you look at the risk of a concept. So, if you come with a completely novel device with novel materials and a novel protocol and novel, all of those things start to make things very difficult to get your arms around, and therefore less likely to be something that can be embraced by a system and to move forward. So things like using GRAS, materials that are already well known in healthcare, existing indications, something that might, or maybe an easy additional existing indication, or something that slides very easily into an existing protocol without disrupting, sort of very well thought through and already very well established norms about thinking about how to introduce your device and so on. These things are not unimportant, and you heard them quite clear. Everything I was going to say candidly, you heard on the other side of the equation. And then this idea of impact. So sort of that's process stuff, is that think about where those risk points are to make things very easy to get arms around and make sure that you've designed your device well. But then impact, this idea of safety and outcomes, fundamentally, if there's a lot of perceived risk to the patient, obviously those become non-starters. So how do you establish in your testing or whatever testing that you provide, it has to pretty much present a clear opinion of a clear safety profile. But then outcomes, and Sandra, thank you for saying that at the beginning. We don't talk about this in all the things we do, but really all the things we do, regulatory reimbursement, IRBs, whatever it might be, this idea of impact, because people want to know that this extra work that you are putting on everybody's shoulder is going to be for a good reason. And financial is often at the top of that, but there are bigger and equal motivators too when it comes to patient outcomes. So you don't have to have studies that have boiled the ocean, but you do have to have studies that demonstrate that the materials that you use are already well known and the mechanisms are known, and maybe you're contriving them in a different way, or the device itself, but the fact that you're going to change outcome in a very positive way. So sometimes we don't think about including those things when we submit for IRB sometimes, or even submitting, like for instance, for regulatory approval, depending on where we think the emphasis is. But I think those are key things that we don't think about. There's very small and inexpensive things you can do to make sure that you're well prepared as you go in.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Super helpful, and love the focus on risk assessment. I think sometimes people are like, well, we don't want the hospital to know all these possible risks, but in fact, the more you can actually lay out that you've thought through all of them and how you've mitigated them in your design and protocol as well from happening, the happier they're going to be to see that you've actually thought this through. So glad that you brought that up, Paul. Maria, I'd love to hear from you on some best ways startups can design preclinical studies to generate this meaningful data that actually is going to translate into their ultimate clinical study and the results that they're hoping to see through that.
Sure. So the way how I go about this is that I do keep updated regularly on clinical research. So my go-to method, it's I educate myself extensively, like, every day I'm reading on what is it that is out there, how other researchers especially are doing it, for example, in our case with COPD and exacerbation management. And I also use, when I try to put together a template, I use clinicaltrials.gov, obviously, to learn from other people who have done it before and probably know better than I do. When I put it together, also I use a lot of AI. There are a lot of tools out there. Cloud is my favorite so far, and I bring my own editorial person into the process. We have actually somebody in-house driving most of this effort. And I do share these drafts with the clinical PIs that I partner with. There is a lot of back and forth. So if you have ever, written, a clinical paper, a peer review paper in any way is very similar to what happens throughout that process. So, it's exactly the same, actually, a lot of back and forth. And I always try to also get together a diverse team to put it all together. I mean, besides the clinicians, obviously, the engineers, people like Paul who have done it in the past and have a lot of experience also with IRB management. And I think this approach has really helped me to get better as a CEO because, I mean, in my case, for example, I haven't practiced in 13 years so far. I left clinical medicine many years ago, and I don't practice medicine as an internist or a pulmonologist. So I'm capable of, like, knowing and accepting, right, that I'm not an expert on anything pulmonary so far. That said, one of the things that I should have probably done better from the start is to actually involve a regulatory person. But to be honest, I haven't had really good experiences with regulatory experts so far. I don't know. I think that many of them were either previous regulators, or they are very strict about a lot of things, and they don't know much about, like, clinical matters. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm still sort of like trying to figure this out. And one of the very interesting things that happened recently, we actually submitted a breakthrough designation that got denied. But I learned a lot about that process, and the letters that we got from the FDA were pretty much, clinical related. So as a CEO who, happens to be a physician, that actually encouraged me to do more on the regulatory work of the company, and now more motivated to sort of like of getting involved into the regulatory
Yeah.
part.
I'm sure you've learned a ton along the way as well.
Oh.
I'm trying to put that hat on. And I mean, in startups, we all know we don't pay ourselves as much as we probably should. But what are some of these other cost drivers when you're starting to plan and then eventually execute a clinical trial? And how can startups try to manage these costs without excessive CRO fees? Like, Maria, you mentioned you haven't really worked with the regulatory consultants, but what other costs did come up during this planning process?
No, I mean, I have work. I have hired 6 people.
You shouldn't like
Because
working with them.
I don't know. There is something. So the thing is, like, to tell you the truth, I don't, maybe they are not, I mean, bad or anything like that. It's just the fact that respiratory is a pretty difficult field so far. It's not, there is not a lot of innovation going on. And FDA can be very tricky on the requirements. So let's talk about this clinical trial stuff, especially with fees, because I like to run a very lean company. Overhead definitely is the main killer and pain for all of us. And I think one of the things that I've seen is that it varies pretty much depending on the PI's reputation, the location, and obviously the experience, right? Like, you're gonna get different codes depending on where you are. So for example, if you are at an Ivy League institution, I got a quote for $8,000 per patient. But if I wanted to go to like a type, university that it doesn't have the big name, right? Or the title, I could probably get 60% of the price. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, in my honest opinion, I think that it's more important to pick the right principal investigator. In general, I mean, all of them are busy. You know, they are either clinicians, they obviously practice, and they have 1,000 other projects to run. And as a little startup, they don't really spend a lot of time with you. That actually you're working with their research team. Um, so I'd rather go with a team that has done it before, especially in respiratory, that have the patients in their cohort. So one of the things that we decided to go forward was to actually map out all of the principal investigators that were funded by NIH for the past several years. So there are these large cohorts, you know, that having following COPD patients up for about 10 years or so. So those were the ones that we specifically targeted. And to me also, the personal connection to our company's mission is very, very important. So if I see that a PI, you know, for example, is doing it much more for like, you know, the money or just to say that, you know, I'm working with a startup because it's cool. I don't probably think or feel that this, you know, person might have a skin in the game. So I try to find somebody else. To me, or at least the way how I run the company, it's all about the, you know, like the mission, the alignment into the, you know, the values that we have, that I have also as a founder myself. Um, and the other thing that I did that was a little bit crazy at the time, and that people, I think I've told you this story before. I actually set up a clinical site for Sama in Florida. So we had a relationship with an ivory tower, like very, very famous PI. It didn't really work out well. So it was in the middle of the pandemic, and I called my friend on the phone from medical school. He's one of the partners from the largest pulmonary clinic in South Florida. And I told him, you know, I'm gonna get this machine, and I'm gonna give you equity in exchange for the rent that you probably charge me, and I get to test your patients. And you know, he convinced the other partners to say yes, and we did 453 people in 2 years, and I spent about $600,000. So just to get it back to the numbers, you know, per person, I spent about $1,200 instead of 5,000 or $8,000 that it would probably cost me if I were working with you know, an academic center. So you know, and that's actually the data that we're working on, and one of the reasons why we were able to secure a partnership with a pharmaceutical that it's about to go official within the next couple of days. So yeah.
Oh, it's a really good story. Thanks, Maria. And good to
Yeah.
know just how important, I mean, having a strong PI is, and that you can compensate with equity instead of cash if you're
And
strapped for the
Nicole,
medicine.
I'm sure you want to move us on in to other topics, but if I may, a tiny little comment here with CROs. You know, one, when we did a larger study with a lot more sites, then you know the complexity gets to the point where you almost have to use a CRO. It's too much to try to manage as an early stage company. But I will say, and this is old information, but let's say the first startup that I did 10 years ago, we did 2 sites and roughly 30 patients across the 2 sites, so very small in scope. And we hired research organization consultants to help us put together documentation and so on. But frankly, we printed binders. We sent those to, we had a good research coordinator at each site. These were sites that were well accustomed to research. So we printed binders and sent it off. And so all the data was recorded in binders, patient information, results of the procedures and everything. And I personally went to every site. And I was there for every single procedure. And this is a big danger when you use a CRO also, and especially when you're early stage. You will learn so much more about your product, your idea, how it fits in, how it works, where it fails, by being on site. And there's a very real risk here. If you have enough funding to afford to then use a full CRO, it may not be the right answer, candidly. There's too much to be learned. And even if you have a CRO, and again, I'm not saying ways to save money. Unfortunately, I'm probably suggesting ways that might end up being a little bit more costly. But what you gain from it is, frankly, it would be essential to getting your product where you want it to be. And if you're not there, and if there is this intermediary that you lose that connection to the practice or the clinical use of your concept, you're likely not to get far and not go fast, certainly. So anyway, just a little bit of caution about how you might think about a relationship with a CRO, and where things that you are willing to hand off and where you would be wise not to.
Yes.
I just want to add to that, because I do think when I get mentioned about passion of a principal investigator, I think that passion is really about that relationship, right? So building that relationship is huge, and it truly is valuable. And I'm saying this as you know, an organization where if you're coming to us and you don't see that same passion, leave, go somewhere else. It's okay. And mainly because you need that level, and the amount of learning that you'll get from the relationship is huge. So don't feel obliged. If you don't feel that good relationship is developing and they see you more as a collaborator, if they're not seeing you as a collaborator to solve a clinical problem, they're probably not the right partner.
I agree.
Perfect advice. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think echoes what Maria was saying very well. And it's really paramount that you guys are on the same page, both in mission, but also, how you're going to get this done, because you want to eventually, hopefully, work with this PI for multiple studies down the road as well. And I think Paul's advice was also really important, to, not just rely on sending someone else there from, the CRO to observe and take notes, but having folks from your team there, even your engineering team maybe, to see what could be improved in future iterations. Are there other value drivers that you haven't considered that are important during the procedure, and maybe things you could work into efficacy endpoints later on, to further demonstrate your value to payers or for adoption purposes as well. Maybe comments that surgeons are making about how easy it is to place, or the patient is making after the procedure, just how much better they're feeling, things like that. So thank you guys. Really great advice. Want to pivot a little bit to talking about intellectual property. So we know, working with a clinical trial with a hospital system or another healthcare system during this, sometimes there are IP rights that need to be negotiated as part of this, especially when the PI is involved maybe in the design of this trial itself, and could have implications for the design of the device, as we talked about with some of their feedback. So Julie, would love to hear from you from this. How does Mayo Clinic approach IP and collaborations with startups to ensure there's alignment on incentives and long-term collaboration?
So it varies depending on the type of trial you're going to be doing, but overall, Mayo's intellectual property policy is that Mayo owns all the inventions that are developed by any Mayo Clinic employee. That it falls into their category of work they're doing that uses any Mayo resource or lab space or anything with regards to that. Mayo owns that. Now, when we start to talk about some of the clinical trial agreements and some of the other co-development and collaboration agreements we do, Mayo typically still does own that. Very rarely is there an instance where we say we're going to assign our rights over to the commercial entity. What we do instead is exclusively give them options to exclusively license intellectual property that comes out of that research or that work that's happening with them, in exchange for some sort of negotiated exchange in revenue. It could be equity, it could be cash, it could be royalties. Some companies like to front end load it, some companies like to back end load it. So there's no one set. But from an IP perspective, what we're really getting at is that Mayo has the full ability and authority to utilize the IP that's developed by that entity. Now, when we're talking about some of the technologies and solutions we're in the middle of developing, what we license to entities or what we give to them, it's only so far, right? Mayo's only been a part of it for so long. And so once it goes to get regulatory approval and other things, Mayo purchases that back in through our supply chain to use it within our practice, just like any other site would do. There may be some things we do for our own internal research purposes where we're not using that, but there's things there that we do. So really it's a case by case, and also the level. Once you get into, we're doing phase 3 multi-clinical trial designs, there we do assign our rights over, because you're working with so many different groups and organizations that for us to say that one thing that was developed was because of the Mayo individuals that were involved in that, there's no way to parse that out when you're looking at the analysis of the data and everything that's coming through there. So it does vary for the stage of the technology and also the level of support that Mayo provides along the way.
Makes sense. And I, think that it sounds like this collaboration leading to jointly owned IP could be considered a really strong thing, and a hallmark of a good collaboration. Are there other hallmarks of this early collaboration, things that you like to see come out, maybe like conference presentations, that are co-authored, papers that are co-authored, things like that?
So, right. So in our agreements, it's going to say that the first publication coming out of the research, if it's being funded by another entity, is going to be a joint publication. We can't be blocked from publishing. So we can't be in a position whereby somebody's saying you can't publish those results because I don't like them. So that's not gonna work. But we will, obviously allow everybody to see the publication, have it be joint, have it been, if there's something truly confidential of the commercial entity that they don't want in there, which wouldn't be the results of the study, but something there that can be stripped out. So we work very closely with them on what that first publication looks like coming out of these research collaborations. The other thing to really think about when we're looking at should we collaborate and what should we do is, are the two entities aligned? What's Mayo trying to get out of this? Is it the same thing than what the company is trying to get out of this? Because if they're not in sync, it's not going to be successful, because it's just going to fall apart, because there's going to be a trust issue. There's going to be something that happens along the way that's just going to break that apart. So I think we look at that quite a bit too. So the other thing also is to really think about, what is it that you're looking for? We've certainly had entities that truly want to engage with us just because they want us to, invest in their companies, because our department does have funds. We do have an investment fund that we can invest in early stage companies and strategic business solutions, that we have the ability to do that. So they try and do, some one-off collaboration in order to make that qualification, but that's really not their intent. And when that falls apart, then that just makes everything hard. So really ensuring that the two entities' strategic goals and alignment match, and we have the right partnership there and the collaboration. Otherwise, it just is not going to work.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think this alignment is so important. And so I'd love to hear now from the startups on their side of the table. So, what advice would you guys give to other startups? So maybe we'll start with Paul on structuring these agreements and contracts with clinical sites to balance, your own flexibility as a startup with the requirements of the hospital, especially around, IP and publishing, things like that. Yeah, start with Paul.
Yeah, I will say, Nicole, from our standpoint, usually we bring the tech to the table and we're partnering with the hospital for sort of the clinical study piece. And so oftentimes it's there's usually not too many rights that are granted then to the hospital in those cases. So in my very limited experience in the world that we play in, oftentimes IP is not an issue. It's already sort of already separated and distinct, and there's just joint work. Now, the PIs can publish on the work that obviously like the results of the study, and there's hopefully interest in doing that. I think that's part of what Sandra was alluding to, that you want to make sure there's passion and interest on both sides. So the interest of publicizing on both sides. But what you have to do as a startup, especially early on, is have a little bit of reservation of right around the depending on the outcomes of the data. And that gets to be a little bit tricky, but I think everyone should be on the same page. We didn't have trouble with that. For instance, if the data just didn't turn out the way that we wanted it to, our opinion was there was harm to us and no real upside for publishing that data. And at least we would want the opportunity to correct or remedy those issues so that we could come and then produce good data and evidence. So those sort of publish rights are something that you can negotiate about not publishing data, or having a bit of discretion of whether the data is publishable. And I think as a startup, you should reserve that right.
Yeah, great advice. Maria, do you feel the same, reserving
Yeah.
right from that?
No, and very good point. Well, I didn't know about that until about 6 months ago when I was talking to two other CEOs. I think that the best way to go about everything is to talk to other founders who have done it already. So I don't know, Paul, how you feel about it, but I'm part of a lot of communities. I literally just keep sending emails or reading the emails from other people where, like templates for contracts, everybody shares them. They can, hop on a video call to just go through everything. Obviously, get a very good lawyer. Yeah, I don't think I think it's pretty straightforward. And you can get a lot of the advice from other founders who have done it already. In my case, we have never had issues with IP. We always keep the IP. And in fact, right now, one of the reasons why we wanted to go internationally too is because one of the players from Latin America is interested in becoming our CRO, but they get into the company as equity holders. So they're going to invest about $1 million for clinical trials, and we keep the IP, we keep absolutely everything. And again, it's all about the mission, right? Like if they really want to help us bring this technology to the markets, especially in low and middle income countries. So they are being very, very flexible with everything, and they have a lot of patients that they have over like 5 million people or affiliates, and we get to tap into those, clinical resources.
Thanks, Maria. Awesome. So want to move now into talking a bit about site selection, especially how we think about international sites as part of this consideration. So as many of you in the medtech community know, international first-in-human trials in countries like Kazakhstan and Georgia are becoming very popular right now. I think there's actually a conference happening maybe this week in Georgia around medtech clinical trials, so very relevant. And so really curious to hear from you guys. So Sandra, we'll start with you and then see if anyone else has any thoughts on this. What are the pros and cons of running these first-in-human trials internationally before bringing these studies back to the US?
Well, it's interesting. I think for a health system in the States, it makes it really nice to be able to have some of those trials run outside the States, because if you can kind of understand and kind of mitigate some risks on the patient side in the US, that all the more better for the patients that we're taking care of. Having said that, and I know there are a lot of incentives and structures that make it extremely helpful to start first in human outside the States. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as an organization is we're still going to need you to go through the process with the FDA, right, before we're doing anything. So one of the recommendations I would have is, as much as it's possible, if you are going to do those international studies, I think you need to still have the conversations with the FDA and begin to understand kind of what they're going to expect, because some of the results are not going to translate automatically into the States. And if they don't, you still got to overcome those challenges. So I think it's a matter of balance, but for us, I like having some de-risking, for lack of a better analogy, in the other countries, but it's still going to need to make sense to be in the States via FDA. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to kind of do some innovative things by going external or external non-domestic, and then begin to think about how do you begin to translate and have that conversation with yourself and your peers. How do you translate that into the US market now? How do you begin to think about that now so that you can mitigate some of those challenges, even doing it internationally, mitigate some of those challenges out of the gate?
Yeah, great advice. Try to maybe de-risk some of those factors you've identified internationally before bringing it back and pitching to one of these large health systems. And great that you mentioned also getting aligned with the FDA at the same time. Paul, did you guys ever consider international trials, or what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, we did actually on a pain management device at the time. Australia was running. Basically, they had incentives, and rather than just tax breaks, you would actually get cash back to conduct in-country studies. So that was up to 40%, I think. So a very significant number. And so for a startup, that becomes very meaningful. So you weigh the sort of the distance and the administrative cost of being remote like that. But we did it. So we did our first in-human study for this pain management device in Australia. I will say it was during COVID, so there was an immense amount of legal, immigration, and other work that became huge issues for us. But that aside, we launched that first in-human study, but I think we quickly came to the conclusion that for exactly the reasons that I talked about earlier, is that you really want to be on site. You want to have and you've heard this now from all four of us, direct communication, contact, and relationship with the people that are conducting the study, because this truly is part of the development of your concept. And frankly, that's just very hard to do when you're cross-border. So I think that's one thing, is that we brought most of that work stateside afterwards at a much greater expense, but I think it became clear after we launched the first site in Australia that it was just going to be not quite what we envisioned it was. And by the way, just simply, you usually go ex-US because it's cheaper and faster. Part of the reason it's cheaper and faster is simply because I don't know if this is the right way to say it, and forgive me, that the processes are streamlined. Let's just put it that way. So it's cheaper and faster to get studies done ex-US. But just because of that, you also have to be careful about the quality of the data that you generate there, and if you look at someone like Sandra and bring that to her and say, here's the study I did, ex-US, she's going to want to know a lot more about, the protocols and so on, because there is a little bit more squishiness when you do some of these, depending on the place, obviously. Um, so you do have to be careful. But I will say that there are many places, and you mentioned too, that are becoming, fairly, people are gaining a higher level of comfort with them. So like for instance with programming, we very quickly learned that you could find very capable and much less costly programmers ex-US, and you figure out how to deal with distance and geography. Very, very different thing, but I think
Yeah.
the concept applies. And so being
Yeah.
smart about the place is obviously then therefore important. But again, caution about the distance. It means less likely that you're going to be there for every patient. And if so, it is travel is not an insignificant cost and distraction, frankly, to launching a med device, as it were.
Sure. And great lead into Maria, because she has not only run clinical trials outside the US, but has a lot of programmers outside the US as well in Colombia. So
Nope.
Maria, what are your thoughts on this?
No, Paul, you put it perfectly. I mean, the decision was made because we actually have a team in Colombia, so they are heavily involved with all of the product development. We run usability studies almost every month. So yeah, I agree. I mean, it might be cheaper and streamlined, et cetera, but it has actually a lot of cons, a lot of challenges. So for example, in our case, we have to be, we need to be involved in every single step from, the design, the protocol. We need to bring on, Americans, US, experts to oversee, double check absolutely everything, because they don't have as much experience. And even if it's just, for regulatory clearance in Colombia, there are a lot of gaps that we have noticed anyway. So yeah, you have to proceed with caution, with a lot of knowledge of the ecosystem, the culture, especially the culture, because for example, in Latin America, everything takes 4 times more in time, right? So I don't know. I mean, it's a balance. You have to really think carefully about, obviously, the partner that you're choosing. In our case, again, I mean, there is a payer. We have access to millions of people. They are heavily involved with or interested in making it successful. And again, also the principal investigators. We tried out with other principal investigators throughout the country, but a lot of them actually didn't have access to patients, or didn't have the time, right? Or 1,000 other different reasons why. So yeah, it's not to, you shouldn't take it lightly. Even though it might be cheaper, you need to be very, 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 very involved.
Yeah. Like at what cost? And great for you guys that you guys have staff in Colombia to help, be there on site. To Paul's point, it's so helpful to have someone in person there. Want to come back to, some topics around like why we do these studies in the first place. So generally, regulatory approval, of course, but also for reimbursement payment down the line. So Paul, would love to hear from you. As a startup, how should one harmonize their regulatory and reimbursement strategies to utilize these clinical studies in the best way possible?
Yeah, this word harmonize, I we use that term because it's often how we think about, both those efforts is, essentially framing them very similarly in terms of data, but candidly, what I might say is how we disharmonize them, frankly, because like to give you an example, one of the devices we launched was a skin grafting device. And when you talk to regulatory agencies, they're concerned about safety and whatever your claims are. You just got to have evidence to support your claims, and it's fundamentally what they want to be sure that you are faithful to. That's not going to harm people, and that it's going to actually do exactly what you say it's going to do, not more and not less. So knowing that, and we use that term risk, we've used that, all of us have used that term risk now many times. So knowing that, it behooves you to approach regulatory agencies, not with a sort of, this is not about obfuscation. It's also not about hiding anything, but it's about putting the right information in front of the right audience. So, and when you talk about the word novelty, obviously, if you're talking to an agency that's controlled about safety and claims, that becomes something that also raises eyebrows. So I think it behooves you to make claims as much as there is predicate or similarity to what is going on today. What is state of the art? Where establish as much as a baseline as you can that connects to, like I said earlier, materials, but also processes, but also methods that are already employed in other concepts today, so that the idea of risk can be really packaged to the real specific area where there's novelty. That'll help you design a more focused trial. That'll help you also be very clear about to agencies like the FDA where you need to spend more time convincing or showing them, creating data and demonstrating that you're safe and have the right outcomes. But then when you talk on the regulatory side, to sort of be certain that you're eligible for procedure codes or whatever it might be for payment, as it were, that's where the aspect of novelty and new invention is important to talk about that way, because otherwise there's no need to bring new ideas to bear and have them reimbursed if there's other cheaper ideas already on the marketplace. So, but so in that case, the idea of talking about where you are novel, how you are employing new ideas that come out. Let me be specific, if I may. So in that skin grafting example, it was largely a harvesting and deposition device. So it was really an electromechanical device that was harvesting skin tissue and placing it in another place. So when we talked to the FDA, we used grass materials, as I mentioned before. And we used cannulas for the harvesting. And here's the beauty: is that cannulas are already on the shelves in stock rooms in hospitals today. So we basically sort of built an idea that these are parts that are already in a hospital. We just assembled them in a slightly different way. So from the idea of safety and understandability, it was sort of fairly straightforward. But then when we're talking to reimbursement or on the payment side, we talk about the novel mechanism of healing that can be brought with autologous tissue, which again, we don't need to prove because these are ideas that are already inculcated in medical school and well established as kind of the gold standard if you think about wound healing and tissue repair. So that's what we exploited. We didn't have to prove that that was the case because that's established, but we proved that we could bring that mechanism to bear in a novel delivery sort of setup. So anyway, hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of what I mean about focusing on the right things with the right people, and that does not mean including everything. It's what you need to assure the agencies that you've done the right work to check off the boxes that they need to check off.
And
Great.
can I just echo something there as well? And it seems obvious in many respects, and sometimes it's not. If there are existing CPT codes, IC9 codes, whatever they are, make sure you understand what currently is available that you can get reimbursement for, that your technology or your solution may fit into, because it goes a long way to being able to get reimbursed and really understand what that reimbursement looks like, at least from a range perspective, because you can begin to make some decisions as to whether or not you may need something totally different. I mean, if you get a reimbursement code and physicians may get paid $25 for it, well, you're going to have a long way to getting them to try and use something that potentially they think is just throwaway money. And I hate to say it that way, but the adoption of something new has burden, right? It has a burden to it. And so they're always going to be looking at reimbursement burden as compared to the burden to actually use a new technology. And I use a low cost example as just kind of to make the point, but leverage existing codes and reimbursement strategies that are out there and make sure that you don't underestimate how fast they can enable you to get into the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
Great advice. Yeah, using those codes to get in, and then maybe the evidence that you're generating in these later clinical trials can help justify a new technology code down the line for that higher reimbursement rate as well. So yeah, we're thinking about startups right now and how they can really guide their innovations toward this regulatory reimbursement readiness down the road. So Julie, are there specific frameworks or support structures that Mayo Clinic has developed to guide these early stage innovators in this process? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
If we're talking about internal Mayo Clinic innovators who are working on early stage protocols developments, algorithm development, how to utilize specific sets of data, we certainly do have privacy and legal staff that help with the regulatory, some of the, filing an investigator-initiated IND, things like that. We do have that support structure internally in-house at Mayo to help guide that, to make sure we're going down the right path. As soon as we start to partner with a commercial entity, though, those individuals internally that are internally Mayo facing would not be involved in guiding and providing advice to the commercial entity, because at that point in time, Mayo is not going to be the lead entity that more than likely is going to do the development, the marketing, and understand how they're going to take it forward. So we really do rely on the commercial entity that's going to take that forward and that we're working with to bring that aspect to the table. We certainly can provide them the information that we have, the things we've done, things we've had to do from that regard, but we will not be the ones that would be advising a startup entity how they should get regulatory approval, things that they need to do. That's just not a risk that we're going to take on for the entity.
Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, have that experience either in-house or through the CRO for sure, bringing that in. So, speaking about designing these trials, so some startups are debating whether or not they should basket these trial designs to capture multiple indications. So Sandra, would love to hear from you from your experience. Is this added complexity really worth it? Oh, now you're muted.
I have to say, there was this pharmacist that used to say, we're going to hell in a handbasket. I always worry that sometimes basketing is just, it's so fraught with complications that, most organizations and most PIs are going to shy away from basketing because depending on the technology and the solution that you're working on, it may create more conflict in really understanding what's driving the opportunity and where the technology I get nervous and jerky with the basketing. I'm just being very blunt because it does have challenges when it comes to adoption. A lot of clinicians are going to ask, okay, but my patients are different, or how does it work specifically in this patient population? And I think it's a difficult thing to for our staff and our physicians to really begin to think about and overcome. Part of that may just be that's how we've always done things, right? We haven't really necessarily done basket trials as much. So I'm open to hearing. I would love to hear others on the panel opine on this, but like I said, be careful because you can go to hell in a handbasket.
Makes sense. Paul, Maria, you guys have thoughts on this? And I love the hand basket for the basket indications.
Yeah, I'm struggling with this question on a current case right now. This idea of develop. You need more data to make broader claims. Obviously, that's the trade-off. You definitely would like to have as broad claims as you can so that it can be used and indicated, just like Sandra nicely laid out, as often as a clinician would like to use it. I tend, my perspective is always through the sort of the scrappy entrepreneur. And so Sandra, the way I think about this problem is that, you try to be a little bit laser focused. Here, let me say it this way. You come up with an indication that gets you into a market with a large enough low-hanging fruit playground so that you can sort of prove out the concept. If you can make all those things true, and there are a lot of things, it's an and. If you can make all those things true, then the narrower claim, the shorter clinical evidence you need to provide, and the faster path to a cleared product is just that's what I've always pursued. But again, you have to make sure it's worthwhile, that if you get it approved, like you said, if you put a device in the hands of a clinician and he or she can only pull it out on every 50th patient, after 1 or 2 patients, by the time the 200th patient comes around, that's now number 4, that's properly indicated, they might forget about your product and not pull it off the shelf anymore. And that is a real risk, even though fully indicated and so on. If it's too rare and too narrow an indication, even if it's on the shelf right in the patient treat room, clinician's not going to pull for it. So, this is a very tricky one. But just from oftentimes you think of the early stage entrepreneurial's question is very scant resources and how do you get to market quickly. So that's why I've always had a bias for have a clear indication that you can have enough playground when you are cleared and get into the market that you can then return and augment your indications. So I've always thought of it mostly as a 2-step approach.
Yeah, so keep it clear and straightforward, but covering as many possible patients as you can with that indication. Sounds like so great. Awesome. So last week we had our webinar on breakthrough device designation in the TAP program, and many of the startups in MedTech Innovator, and I'm sure also watching on LinkedIn, are going after this pathway. And so I'm curious, how does hospital involvement in pilots intersect with FDA programs like TAP, for example? Sandra, I'd love to hear from you on this.
I think it's a lot of it has to do with, for us, is the market need again. I hate to keep going back to that, but breakthrough designation with a large market is huge, right? So we're definitely very open to that. I think a lot of it is really dependent on what the comfort level of the organization is, and the risk profiles. But we definitely don't shy away from it. We definitely take a critical look at it. And I think if you have that ability to go after breakthrough, you go for it.
Yeah. Maria, do you have any thoughts on this? You guys
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
you guys are going through this. Awesome. So Maria, maybe another question for you. So we talked about, clinical trials for, regulatory approval, and then, ultimately reimbursement, but adoption is really the key thing here to getting usage. And we talked about this already. How do we convince, the surgeons the hospitals put this on their shelves and the surgeons to actually use it? So I was curious how you guys are approaching your data collection strategy at SMI to not just support your regulatory reimbursement pathways, but also support future sales conversations with these KOLs.
Yeah, absolutely. You always need to talk, customer discovery, talk to your clients, talk to your, customers anyway. And it's actually linked to Paul's latest comments regarding the basket trial. So one of the things it's true that we need to be super laser focused on the trials that we are designing and the type of indication that we are going after. But we started getting asked a lot of questions about other obstructive diseases that might look similarly to, like, for example, COPD, which is our main indication for use. So we decided to add on asthmatics and even healthy controls because we needed to, answer the clinical questions, right? Like when doctors were coming, back to us, like, what if it's asthma, but then, it's actually a pretty difficult disease to diagnose. You can either misdiagnose them fairly easy. So we ended up adding more patients into our cohort of 450 something people, just because, obviously it was easier. It was just, the same pulmonary practice, same patients coming through the same door. We just decided to recruit them. So, like, operationally was pretty easy to go after them. Besides that, yeah, it was cheaper the way how we were doing it, but it was just convenient. And obviously the healthy controls, again, a lot of questions about, like, but Maria, there is a lot of attracting healthy people and they don't know about it. What if it's just normal and you are probably seeing something that it's not actually real? So we decided to, start recruiting people. We use social media, Facebook, you name it, even WhatsApp. We ended up having, about 150 or so. And that actually helped us build better algorithms. And now our accuracies are pretty much, are very, very high. So yeah, it's always, talk to the people that you're planning on, selling or interacting with. They will
Yeah,
tell you
maybe
what they need.
see what these KOLs want to see before they're willing to pull the trigger as well. And if that's comparisons to more healthy subjects, sounds like that was a great win for you guys to do that.
Even Paul told me that I needed to include healthy controls for our exacerbation trial.
He's the one that told. That's great.
He was like, I have all these questions, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do 20.
Awesome. So I'm curious from the hospital perspective now. So Sandra, as a startup looks at generating evidence for these value analysis committees or VACs, how can they best design a post-market study? So like different endpoints, number of sites, demographics, to create the biggest impact to eventually scale this technology within a health system like Hackensack.
Well, I think for us, we partner a lot with some of these startup companies, and we'll tell you these are the kind of things that we're looking for for your technology. If it's in the purchasing side of things, if it's the value analysis side of things. So, we want you to be successful. So, and success for us means that the patients are doing better, right? It's overall better patient care and outcomes. So it really is, ask us the questions, but more importantly, let us ask you the questions and define very specifically what we want. Our questions are really should give you the answers to what we're looking for, right? So I think you really sit down and have a conversation with what's the financial picture of this. Let's assume that the technology or the solution has the outcome. Then the question is, how do you make a business decision? How do you make a purchase decision? Who are those purchasers? And how do they make a decision? And usually it's not just one or the other, it's an ecosystem of deciders. And I think that's the critical thing, particularly from a health system perspective. You got a lot of people that have to opine on moving forward with a device or a technology. And they have very different key metrics that they're looking at, and to make them successful or to ensure that the organization is going to be successful in implementing this technology. So I say, ask the questions, are there guidelines? And then if you are collaborating with a health system, say as a collaborator, why would you buy this? When would you buy it? That's the other thing, is when. And it is a long buying cycle. So make sure you understand those answers and the key questions right out of the gate, because it will take a while to get through a buying cycle.
But not only to add on to that, not only to that, you need to understand how it's going to fit into the clinician's workflow. If you're going to make if the device that's coming to the table is going to make their workflow harder, they're not, it doesn't matter how good the technology is, they're not going to use it. So you, as part of your pitch and what you're doing, and as you're designing it, you really need to understand that workflow. How does it fit in? How does it save them time? How does it save them money? How does it give them better outcomes? What's the benefit of that individual picking this up and using it in the practice?
Yeah, thanks, Julie and Sandra. Great. And brings back Paul's point as well, and using things they're comfortable with already have in the hospital. So how do you make their lives easier as part of this adoption process? We had one question roll in from LinkedIn that I want to make sure we cover for Maria. Is there any specific standard that you look for in the international institutions that you do clinical trials with, meaning if Joint Commission approved or good clinical practice certifications are a priority?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, usually it's the people that publishes the most. So you would either get this information from, like American Thoracic Society or anything like regional wise. And if you start talking to, for example, anyone who's practicing in the field, they will tell you the names of the people that do a lot of research. Like, in my case in Colombia, I started with one pulmonologist. I ended up, knowing everybody else within the same, network anyway. And then, I mean, it's also about the clinical expertise on research that they have with pharmaceuticals too. So that's a very high bar that they need to sort of like get through. So that's another like sort of like a filter to use. And then you start talking to people, you would see rapidly who actually has experience and knows how to do things, depending on the time that they spend, the processes that they put you through, the conversations that you have, you can easily sort of like, figure out who actually knows what how to do it. So yeah.
That makes sense. Hopefully that was helpful to whoever asked on LinkedIn. Just got a few more questions here, so I'll try to go through maybe 5 more minutes before we move into just our cohort session. But Paul, curious to hear from you, because you're at the Harvard Grid now. What role do innovation hubs and academic centers play in helping these startups evaluate and these clinical trials and ultimately execute these studies, both first in human all the way to post-market?
Yeah, and Nicole, I think thank you for asking. Our goal is to see is to play a support role, and so we do that in any way that we can think of that is useful and productive. And when we talked about this before the call in the prep, this is focused on sort of grants and financing, and a lot of centers do. We provide grants for lab-based research, not just for sort of general entrepreneurship. I don't have the financial wherewithal to do that, but we do for lab-based research. So if this idea was germinated and developed in a lab, then we have de-risking grants, and we can work with our faculty and researchers to do sort of maybe that last mile de-risking, so that it could be eligible for external funding and then get launched into further study and market launch. But I'd say, there's a much bigger role than that, because I think a lot of what we also do is try to bring the right people to the team, as it were. If you think about team as being a much broader concept, is that it's this collection of advisors, people you call up and consult, investors, co-founders, whatever it might be. But it's a large collection of people that, will help you get the idea launched. And Maria, you said that earlier, which is pick up the phone and call somebody who's done it before. And that is a big part of the value that we try to drive, is that, if we see an idea, like I came with a med device background, but we work with quantum and robotics and physics and math and big AI decarbing grid ideas. I mean, the number of things that we cover is very broad. So that clearly is not something that I can do alone. So the real reason, the real way we have impact is just being able to bring sort of the right expertise to the table at the right time. And so that's really, money is almost the least important aspect of what we do. So I think that's the best and useful way, and stay connected if you, as long as you can, but I sit within the four walls of an academic institution. So once an idea is funded and launched, unfortunately, that means I can't be involved anymore. Harvard, at least I haven't checked recently, but I think we're still a nonprofit. So that means I can't get involved in things once they're funded. But so that all that means is that while you are sort of in the nest still, while you haven't launched yet, or while you haven't been funded, if you're not, you're really missing out on lots of support that will take you further faster. And so that's our mantra.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And definitely those of you listening, if you're part of an academic institution, take advantage of those resources. They often, have ties to the hospital systems affiliated as well. So like Harvard, for example, great med school that you can run clinical trials at. So utilize those connections and build your team appropriately to take advantage of those as well. And then want to end on, some of the other benefits of these partnerships, especially with healthcare systems, beyond the initial clinical trial that you're running with them. These hospitals often sit on very large data sets of past trials as well. So what are the best ways for startups to access and use this data for maybe healthcare economic analysis, for justification, for, reimbursement payment down the line? So who actually owns this cost of care story across the hospitals? So Sandra, would love to hear from you on, who owns this and how do you take advantage of it?
Yeah, the cost of care, it really is owned by the health system. I mean, if you're working with the health system, we own the cost of care story. So the question then becomes, what is the data set that drives that cost of care story? So how do you tell that story? I think, I will be very direct and say a lot of organizations like us are trying to figure out the best way to leverage data that can in turn not just, promote, startup capabilities and meeting some of the endpoints of a clinical study or trial, but also how do we leverage that to a greater degree? How do we more democratize that information in a way that can make sense? So it's a challenge, but I think at the end of the day, you've got to ask the questions of how do I prove that cost of care story, right? How do I fit into that cost of care story? And the health systems own it. They'll tell you exactly how you fit in. It's not an easy part. It's not easy to access though. So if you want to do a clinical study or you want to do a proof of concept, those are probably the easier ways to do it.
Yeah, and Julie, from your perspective, how does Mayo Clinic think about enabling startups to responsibly access and leverage these large clinical trial data sets for their own evidence generation?
So Mayo Clinic obviously has 160 years worth of longitudinal patient data. And so we have a vast array of data and information. And so a few years ago, Mayo started what we call Mayo Clinic Platform that has all of our electronic health record information DID'd in a certified environment. And so companies can, subscribe to get access, and they can do cohort building. So I have an algorithm that I just want to test on data. They can bring that algorithm into that environment, run it against the DID set to see, is it working? Is it giving me the results that I want? Or I want to develop a new one. Can I use that data to help train an algorithm? The data itself never leaves that certified DID environment, but you can build solutions on top of it. They have a marketplace where people can put their solutions, and it's called Deploy. There's also, a program there called Orchestrate, where biopharma and other startups that want to do drug discovery or see, patients like me, what are these patients doing and what markers and what criteria do they have? So you could build your own cohorts based upon the criteria that you're looking for and have access to that. So there's a large group at Mayo Clinic, as I said, Mayo Clinic Platform, that handles that, and it's also federated. So we also have other institutions, not just Mayo's data, that's a part of that program too. And none of it's commingled. Their data is housed behind a certified DID environment in their facilities, but individuals that can come in can pull data and do different things from those different groups and have access to different people's environments. So that's just another way that we work through that. And we have an Accelerate program that's part of that, that some people may know about, the startup companies that have come in and do their 30-week program there. They get access to some of that data. They get access to experts at Mayo Clinic and mentors and VCs and other things that's part of that program, that you can sign up to help utilize that. So that's kind
a
of how
great
we're
resource.
looking at it today.
Yeah,
Julie,
thanks.
that was called the Mayo Platform. Is that the proper
Mayo
name for
Clinic
it?
platform, correct.
Mayo Clinic Platform. All right.
Yeah, for our cohort, I will drop that in Slack for you guys so you can look into that. But definitely look into that Mayo Clinic Platform Accelerate for those of you listening. So great to know about that resource and that you guys have such a dedicated team on that specifically to help out startups. So with that, I'd like to end the public live stream portion of today's webinar. So thank you so much, first of all, to our panelists, Maria, Paul, Julie, and Sandra, for joining us here today and sharing your expertise on how to navigate clinical trials on both sides of the table. Great to hear your wisdom today. Hope that you will all join us next week for Cleared Pathways, Building Proof in Product at Scale. So this webinar concludes kind of our regulatory clinical trials thoughts. We're going to be moving into, so next week's will be about manufacturing scale up, supply chain, and a bit more about how to design your post-market studies intelligently considering this. And then we'll have some sales-focused webinars in the coming months. So thank you so much to everyone who joined, and thank you to our panelists. Hope everyone has a